Good morning to everybody. Welcome to this second day of our symposia. I will thank the colleagues who gave me the honor and the pleasure to chair this special session, which bridges the yesterday session focused on the local, Prato, with the today session focused on the rest of the world, Europe and Italy. And this you will see, this presentation will add a global perspective to our local findings. I briefly introduce our guests. Donald Fels is an internationally reputed visual artist whose main interest focused on the effects of globalization, and in particular on the relations between the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures around the world. His works were exhibited in many museums of contemporary art all over the world, and also in Italy, especially in Bologna. Gary Hamilton is professor of international studies and of sociology at the University of Washington, but he has been visiting professor and has studied for many times at the Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong universities. Actually, he is a scholar specialized in Asian societies and especially in economic organization of these Asian societies. On those topics, he wrote dozens of articles and many books. Among the latter, in 2012, he co-edited The Market Makers, How Retailers Are Reshaping the Global Economy. In 2006, he published Commerce and Capitalism in Chinese Societies. In the same year, he co-edited Emergent Economies, Divergent Paths, Economic Organization and International Trade in South Korea and Taiwan. In 1997, I like to remind that he co-edited a book entitled The Economic Organization of East Asian Capitalism. So he's a truly expert. I give the speaker now.
Thank you so much. That was very, very generous. Well, it's our pleasure to be here giving this keynote address. We feel very humble about this. I am not an expert in the Wenzhouese Diaspora, and this is my first time visiting Prato. Don has been here a number of times and spent some time here, but we don't see ourselves as experts on this particular topic. But what we do bring to this conference is a kind of a wide view of what's going on, and of particular interest in how the Wenzhou Chinese migration in Prato reflects on larger patterns. And so what we're going to talk about today, and the paper's about 30 pages. We can't read the paper, of course, but we are going to give you an overview of what's in the paper. Now, it's divided into 5 sections. The first section I'm really going to skim over, but it's it sets up the paper itself, because well, I'll talk about it in a second. Then we're going to And then we're going to compare and contrast the two migrations to Prato. Italian peasants on the one hand that came to Prato after World War II, and the Chinese, the Wenzhou Chinese, who began to arrive in numbers, in considerable numbers in the 1990s. And then the last two sections are short. We're going to talk a little bit about how migrations end historically, and what the implications are for modern Italy and modern China. So let me get started. A number of years ago, a very close colleague of mine, Marco Uru, who grew up in Sardinia and who was my student for a number of years, and then a close colleague. We went off to Taiwan one year, and he had been working on the larger project on Asian business, which was me. And when he was in Taiwan, he was just amazed about how similar visually Taiwan was from what he experienced in Italy. And part of this kind of shock to him was there were just so many visual clues to him and so many sociological clues that Italy and Taiwan somehow had some commonality to it. So he went back and wrote a paper published in a number of places on the small firm economies, and his title was Institutional Logic of Small Firm Economies, in which he compared the two. So drawing on our mutual research in Taiwan and drawing on his own research and the research of others in Italy, he wrote this paper, and he said there are 4 areas of similarity which produce this really close similarity. And I'll just skim over those because we'll come back to these later, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more about this in the question and answer section. He says at the core of the phenomenon is really family businesses, small family businesses. And at the core of small family businesses is a capital lineal patriarchy. So there was a kind of a patriarch that runs the business. The small firms are organized across the region, within an area that is, based on the strong entrepreneurship, but also the strong independence of these small firms. So these are really family businesses, and they maintain their independence. But in order to maintain their independence in a small firm location, you need to make alliances with other small firms. So you can't do this by yourself. And so it's the alliances that really make the economy work. And so he talks about this in terms of personal ties and business networks. The personal ties are between people. So it's really one businessman to another. In Chinese, it's called one laoban to another laoban. And the personal ties work in conjunction with the ability to create business networks which make money. If you don't make money, you can't pull things together. But once you make money, you begin to generate a kind of reciprocity and honor that goes with the business itself. So you begin to build a sort of an institutional logic in that location. And then that builds on top of the personal savings. That is true. In Taiwan it's true. It was true that small firms have difficulty obtaining capital from banks and credit institutions. So you need to generate such capital as you have from within your network, usually family, retain savings, retain profits, and various kinds of mutual credit associations. And you reinvest back into your business so that you begin to seal these ties, and you begin to develop an agglomeration effect. And so it's the agglomeration that makes the whole thing work. Now, in looking at knowing Asia and looking at the Prato experience, which is very famous for its small firm economy, and in China, in the private firm sector, and other locations, the logic seems to really sort of create an institutional structure that perpetuates this kind of small firm economy. Now, our argument here is, in this section, that on the surface, the Chinese, Wenzhou Chinese, are very similar to the Italian peasants that came here prior to World War II. The Italian peasants, as Donald will talk about in a second, arrived after World War II and developed a small firm economy that was very famous, famously reported by a number of people, including our illustrious producer. Likewise, the Chinese have developed an equally small firm and equally dynamic economy. So we want to compare these now, but now we want to look at how they differ and how we should think about these as quite a different economy in the long run. So let me turn to Don. Don will talk about Prato and about Italian peasants.
Before I start, I did want to thank two people in particular. Cecilia, who is sitting right there, and Cecilia Perchini is here. Oh, here you go. How's that? Can you hear me? Is it on? No, it's not on. How do you?
Okay. I'll start again. I wanted to thank Cecilia Hewlett, who, along with Silvia Pericini, who's a journalist here, I had the great pleasure over a period of months having some really inspiring conversations with both of them, and that helped me shape some of my thinking, which I'm going to share with you now. As it says on the board here, this is not new business in Prato. Prato's interest and basis with the textile economy goes back a long, long way. And fascinatingly, there have never been very many sheep here, if any. So it's an interesting thing when you start to think about Prato as a place. Some of the discussion, for instance, that appeared in the film last night, people seem to think it's strange that the Chinese would come here and work. Well, it might equally be strange to think, why is Prato a place of wool? There's really no production of wool out of animals here. It's always come from afar. So Prato has always been a magnet for business that's come from afar and somehow percolated through here. Wait, did I go up or down? No, that's down. Okay. Okay, this is a map, and it'll be reproduced in the paper so you can look at it a little better, but it's a global map showing how wool gets to Prato. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't come off of sheep that are grazing in fields nearby. It's come from a long way away and has been doing that for several centuries. Now, some of this, I'm sure, is known by some of you, but I'll go over it just real quickly. I think most of you are aware that the Arte della Lana Guild, the Florentine Guild, was probably, arguably, the most powerful of all the guilds in Florence. And as I'm sure most of you know, the guilds were really essential masters of the work that happened. And Prato, up until a decade ago, was directly under the thumb of the Fiorentini. And the Arte della Lana, because it was a guild that was based in Florence, not in Prato, made it actually law that the Pratesi could not produce first-rank woolen goods. This is, I think, an important thing to remember. So much of the discussion that we'll get into later on about, in the film last night, about Pronto Moda being not of the right quality for Prato. Well, if you take the longer view, the Fiorentini guaranteed that the work coming out of Prato could not be of the highest quality. That was written in to the guild's provisions. The people in Prato could produce woolen goods, but it could not compete with the luxury goods that the Florentines were producing. Now, of course, this was 500 years ago. But I argue that some of these rules became accepted into the undercurrent of Prato even today. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, it doesn't really work in Italian, but in English, the word shoddy actually means, it's used in regular discourse, and it means something that isn't quite up to snuff, something that isn't quite as good as it appears. That's actually an adjective. If I say this cappuccino is shoddily made, it means that it's not a very good cappuccino. Well, that word actually comes from a British creation. In 1813, a man by the name of Law, which is interesting, invented a machine in, of all places, Britain, the land of wool, because Napoleon had put an embargo on wool movement throughout the British Isles. So they couldn't get enough virgin wool. So this gentleman invented a machine that essentially tore apart existing garments. It wasn't a very sophisticated machine, but it did the job. So he took, 150 years ago, or exactly 200 years ago, he got old sweaters, coats, and threw them in his machine, and the machine shredded the sweaters and coats and produced new fibers out of this old stuff. Now, in the film last night, you got to see, it didn't show the machine at work, but about 50 years after that, Mazzoni, whose statue sits in the main piazza here, and who has a street named after him in Prato for good reason, he was from Prato. He went to study in Paris, and he copied the plans. He saw this machine. He was not allowed to bring any plans back. It was against the law to bring something like this back to Italy. So he memorized the workings of this machine, came back to Prato, and reinvented the shoddy machine here in Prato. So he is the father of the rag business here. And this limped along for almost a century until World War II. I put down here materia prima. I've been doing research in Prato for a while now, and everybody I talk to who's in the stracci business, in the rag business, talks about rags as primary material. Now, in my line of work, I'm interested in following commodities as they move around the world. Generally, that means things like wood, fish, steel, but they're talking about rags as primary material. That's because after World War II, these rags arrived here in bales. They were not always rags when they started. Sometimes they were just used clothing, and people donated after the Second World War. Places like Italy and France had been devastated and needed new clothes, something to wear. So primarily from America, donations were given, and these were sent to people to wear. Well, the stuff that people didn't want to put on their bodies that was too overly used became the materia prima. It got put through this machine and shredded and made into thread. So I also wanted to mention Il Panettore because, like the invention of the shoddy machine, he is a creation of Prato. The Panettore is an entrepreneur who still today, but he was around 100 years ago, he organizes production vertically in Prato, but he owns no factories. So he himself controls nothing directly, but indirectly he controls the entire production from rags to thread to cloth to people who buy it. So he is essential to this whole story because it's through his means that everything gets organized. But it's important to understand that he doesn't own any factories. And a lot of what they did historically before the Second World War was he arranged for women primarily to weave cloth in their homes. So he would visit them, give them the thread, they would finish the cloth, he would pick it up, and then he would carry on the production. All right, I want to go a little bit into the work of Roger Absalom because he's really central, I think, to this discussion. So Absalom was a historian, educated in Britain, who came here and spent, he said, the very best years of his life studying and working in Italy. And his particular finding that I found so interesting was after the Second World War, well, I should go back a step. At the very end of the Second World War, there were something like 80,000 prisoners of war who were from America and Great Britain in prisons here in Italy. And suddenly when Mussolini realized that the war was lost, he made some alliances with his people, and suddenly everybody who was running the show disappeared. So the guys who had the keys to the prison left. And 50,000 prisoners overnight ran out the door. Many of these prisons were located in this area, and they were in the countryside. Most of the prisoners were in ill health. Very few of them spoke Italian, and most of them had no idea where they were. They had just been brought to the prison. But in fact, they were in the Campagna. So within a matter of hours, they started knocking on the doors. This was all unorganized. They started knocking on the doors of farmhouses and asking to be admitted. And almost universally, they were. Now, the contadini, the peasants who were the farmers, were sharecroppers. None of them owned their farms. They worked for, even at World War II, it was feudal, the system. They worked for overlords who demanded most of their production and paid them very little. Somehow, the peasants felt both obliged and willing to let these escapees into their homes. They hid them when Germans or people from the remains of the Italian army would come by looking for the prisoners. The contadini said, "We never saw any prisoners. We don't know what you're talking about." As soon as those people left, the contadini put these prisoners, after they were fed and made a little stronger, to work in the fields because they didn't have enough people to do their work. Their own economy was doing very well because they were selling food, which was very, very needed in Italy, on the black market. So there was a nice reciprocity between the prisoners and the contadini. Now, Absalom, almost 30 years after the fact, went and studied some reports that were done at the immediate end of World War II that interviewed the contadini and interviewed the prisoners, the escaped prisoners, to find out what the treatment was like of these prisoners at the hands of the contadini. These records were sitting in old archives. Nobody had looked at them. And he studied them, and he came to the conclusion that the arrival on their doorstep of these escapees changed forever the point of view of the contadini. So his argument is that the contadini trusted nobody outside their immediate families. For good reason. They had been abused, basically. But for reasons that are very complex, they did trust these men, most of whom they couldn't actually even talk with. Most of them didn't speak Italian. Very few of the contadini spoke English. But somehow, they grew to trust one another, and this trust, Absalom argues, propelled the contadini to see that their life had the possibility of a wider view than they had ever had before. And so he makes the argument that when the war was over and when Prato had bisogno di workers, these peasants streamed into the city, suddenly energized with the possibility that they could do more than they had ever conceived of before. So that's what this note basically says. Sorry. Okay, so the peasants came into the city, and they started, as Gary said earlier, to organize very small firms. These firms were organized around very basic situations. First of all, the peasants were used to doing hard, repetitive work, and they were used to doing it piecemeal, because farming, you do something for a while, and then you do something else for a while. It was all familial. It was people that they knew and trusted. These were small groups. They very often lived in the factories or right next door. Last night in the film, there was an elderly gentleman who said, "Oh yes, this reminds me what the Chinese are doing because they worked very long hours. So did we." Well, they not only worked long hours, but they also lived in the factories, something that isn't discussed much here. What I'm trying to say is that what the Chinese are doing now, much of it was done by the people who set up the textile industry here in Prato after the Second World War. These people built factories that, because of growing demand and because of their efficiency and willing to do hard work, thrived through the 1960s. So here's a picture of, this happens to be cashmere. I took this just a couple days ago in a warehouse here in Prato. These are old sweaters that this firm tears apart. In closing this part, I just wanted to talk about Benetton as an example. So, some of you are old enough, I think, to remember when Benetton sweaters first came on the market. They were very cheap. They were very bright, sexy, colorful. They also contained a great deal of Prato re-engineered wool. Now, the shoddy machine chops up the wool from old sweaters. In the process, it shortens the fibers. There's no other way to do it. They cut it up. And the length of the fiber has a lot to do with the longevity of the garment. So the early sweaters that Benetton made, it was true, they said 100% wool. And they were. But what they really were was a blend of mostly chopped up wool, regenerated wool, and a little bit of new wool. And as a result, the sweaters didn't last. But actually, that was just fine, because Benetton was creating a whole new kind of market, which was based on, you buy it now, it's in moda right this minute, and by the time it wears out, the moda's changed anyway, you buy another one. Now we accept all that now. Zara, all these companies that exist today, that's where it started. And it was based a great deal on their ability to buy very inexpensive wool right here. Wool that was dyed whatever color happened to be of the moment. By the way, Benetton is still buying wool here in Prato. So those sweaters become thread. And that thread gets rewoven into new garments. I think this basically says what I need to say about it. Gabi has done a lot of work on industrial districts, and Prato, of course, is famous for the way this concept has worked here. One thing I did want to say before I give it over to Gary is that there has never been historically a top-down model in Prato. Prato has always been organized as small pieces that fit together, as Gary was saying in the beginning. Neither the state, nor the city, nor unions, nor a big firm has ever organized the various processes in Prato. They've been organized by the impanatori, men who go between these groups. It's a social process, yes. It's never been top-down. It's not like Fiat. It's not like the Anelli family. That's never been the case in Prato, and obviously still isn't today. Okay, so this business of 3 generations, maybe it's an old wives' tale, but many people have told me the same story. The first generation, that would be the ex-contadini that I was just talking about. They worked hard and they profited. Second generation consolidated and conserved their wealth. And the word conserved is important because they became fairly conservative. And the third generation, which now exists, has spent most of the money that was made by the first 2 generations. And the last term here, loss of innovation in entrepreneurship, pretty much categorically here in Prato it's happened as it happens around the world. The third generation is not as innovative. They are less compelled to actually go out and take risks. The money is in the bank. Why worry about it? And as someone told me the other day, now they're renting their ex-factories to the Chinese, so they have a nice income from the rent. They don't really even have to be in business. They can hang out at the bar all day. So in the 1990s, things converged on Prato that Prato had no control over. It says it right up here. Interestingly, one of the things that decreased the demand for wool was the fact that the rooms like this are now heated. When I first started coming to Italy in the 70s, you wore wool sweaters, even sometimes jackets inside. It was never warm inside, never. Well, now that's all changed. So people don't need to wear so much wool, and they don't. Okay, I'm going to give it over to Gary, and then I'll come back after he's finished. Thank you.
Okay, the important point here is that the peasant migration was really a permanent migration. And to think about a permanent migration, it's a desire to leave one place and go to another place and settle there permanently. And in fact, when the peasants left the land, their place back in the sharecropping countryside was gone. They either got new tenants, the landlords, or they put the land to a different use. So there was no way to go back to the countryside. So when the peasants came, they created their small farm economy, each family having a piece of that economy, and they began, the next generation took over that business, and expanded it perhaps sometimes, but by the time that the cousins, so you get the sons, and then the next generation is really a bunch of loosely related people to the founder, cousins or nephews of the founder. You begin to have a differentiated inheritance. How do you inherit is different, and also by that time the sons and the daughters are educated and desire different careers anyway. So you begin to see this generational effect take place, and this is what happened always happens in permanent migration. But the important point here is that the Chinese migration has a very different dynamic to it. The Chinese have migrated for hundreds of years. We can talk about Prato as having a long history. Well, the Chinese migrations of a temporary nature are extremely long-lived. We can begin to sort of pinpoint them. I'm just going to skim over this. In the Ming Dynasty, with the galleon trade to the Philippines, you begin to get lots of Chinese merchants that on a regular basis go to Southeast Asia, go to different parts of Southeast Asia, stay there for years, but also go back and forth to China, where they have families. Sometimes they have two families. The Qing Dynasty closed the door. There was Japanese pirates, and they moved everyone back from the coast. So for a very long time, from about 1644 to actually the opening of China, there was very limited migration until the middle part of the 19th century. This was the time of the Opium War. And at the time of the Opium War, the Westerners opened China to opium trade, as we know, and other things. But at that same time, the Chinese began to migrate in very large numbers. And it was always as a temporary migrant, a sojourner. In the California Gold Rush, which was 1848, gold was discovered, 1849 the rush began. By 1855, Chinese were 10% of the population in California. Huge numbers came out. At the same time, in Southeast Asia, the Chinese began to go to Southeast Asia in very large numbers, sometimes as coolie labor, sometimes as in a variety of professions. And once they got there, they began migration chains that they would go to Southeast Asia, they would work for much of their lives, and then they would return. And there's some really good documentation on the outgoing and the coming back. And in the process of working in Southeast Asia, in California and other places, they would remit large amounts of money to their villages in China. So we can talk about this as a temporary migration. They begin with the idea that they're going to be gone for a short amount of time. And we can think of this also much the way we think about the institutionalization of a small firm economy. This is the institutionalization of a migration strategy. This is not done as individuals, it's done as groups. And as groups begin to migrate, migration chains, they begin to institutionalize the way they do it. So it becomes an easy thing to migrate after a while if you develop these kind of institutions. And the Chinese have been doing this for a very long time. Now, I wrote a paper a number of years ago about temporary migration, as to how we can think about temporary migration as opposed to permanent migration. And in thinking about this talk, I looked at the literature. I read a lot of things about the Wenzhou Chinese, and really we're talking about a temporary migration chain as opposed to a permanent migration. So we should think about these as really different things. Permanent migration as the peasants, temporary migration as the Wenzhou Chinese. Now, I'm talking about the institutionalization of this strategy, but as individuals make decisions along the way, they oftentimes opt out. So sometimes you become a permanent migrant. Sometimes you leave early before you become successful, and oftentimes you never migrate in the first place. So what allows temporary migration to start? Well, I'm arguing there's a kind of a structural conduciveness. First of all, there's a low risk in migration. So usually migration is seen as a mobility strategy to increase your wealth in a not terribly risky way. At the same time, you're able to easily reenter society. So you can take that wealth and convert that wealth into some kind of social status. Now, if you look at and this is true for the other examples I provide in the paper of Southeast Asia, most of the migrants come from very particular areas. There's been some studies about migration villages. The Wenzhou Chinese don't come from Wenzhou primarily. They come from the districts outside of Wenzhou. Just like the Chinese migrants going to the California Gold Rush, they don't come from Guangzhou, Canton. They come from the districts outside Canton. So they're poor on marginal land, and they're connected to the sea. Okay, now the ease of reentry is a very important thing. Once you migrate, how do you get back into the village? Well, these are strong lineage villages, and you are related, so your place in that village is related to where you are among relatives. And so it's easy to come back in because you have a kinship relationship and your family is there, and sometimes they actually send you out to make money. They, in the 19th century and early 20th century, you would marry, you would migrate, leave your family in China, you would come back. Every now and then you would have kids, you'd go out. All your working life was out. Then you would come back and retire, and you would have you would live conspicuously in your wealth. Okay, now now crucial. Some villages become migrating villages, and some don't become migrating villages. It's interesting to think about what allows one village to become a migrating village and the others don't. Now, if you look at the literature on the Wenzhou Chinese, the same thing. You get some villages in the hinterland of Wenzhou being heavily migrating villages. Other districts, you don't get very much migration at all. Part of this is, in fact, the comparison, the relative comparison internal to the countryside between one lineage which is doing much better and another lineage which is doing marginal, and really collectively make a decision to be a migrating village based on usually some kind of fortuitous event which allows the collective village, the lineage group, to see that they could make money from an overseas venture. There's a good example from literature on a lineage right outside of Hong Kong in the New Territories that had their land cut in half. Their farms were cut in half by the Communist Revolution. They had to figure out what to do as a lineage. They began to go to London and to other places in England and then to other places in Europe and start a chain of restaurants. This is the Mon lineage. Well, something like that has gone on here. The Wenzhou Chinese began in the small numbers. They were stone carvers. They thought there were going to be markets in Europe for stone carving. And so the fortuitous quality of that first event led to others migrating, and then yet others, and there was a migration chain back and forth. Okay, so we began to develop this migration chain, and one of the things with that the temporary migrants do is they target niches that are compatible with this strategy of going in and going out. And these niches are areas which they can monopolize economically and make money. Now, one of the distinctive features about temporary versus permanent migrants is that as a temporary migrant, you want to stay together. You want to celebrate who you are. You want to keep your identity. You want to maintain the integrity of your culture. And so there's a sense of exclusiveness there, which is created in part by the creation of many kinds of associations. So surname associations, hometown associations, sometimes religious associations. And the Chinese are really one of the few groups in the world that are able to do this to this extent. So much so that if the Chinatowns around the world, other migrants don't, even temporary migrants don't develop in that time. Okay. Permanent migration, the return migration is there is a way to come back. And once you accumulate your wealth, once you get sufficient money, you come back and resettle in the society. And if you look at the Wenzhou Chinese, tremendous numbers go back. This is not a small time. And there was the discussion yesterday about why would you go back? I mean, so going back, you live conspicuously, you develop your homes, you develop the family grave sites, often outside of the city itself. Okay, to end this, migrations run their course. Permanent migrations end once you begin to go through generations, but it's also true for temporary migrations. The economy changes. Even though the temporary migrants are able to constantly renew the entrepreneurship, the economies in which they are situated change, but also the home society changes. And in China, we're talking about the Wenzhou area as now sufficiently developed that the children of these villages no longer desire to migrate in those numbers. Okay, now there are implications to all this. The Chinese have a saying that all banquets must end. Tian Shao Wu Bishan De Yan Qi. The idea that in the end, this too will end. And so let me turn over to Don to finish this.
I'll make it brief. Our conclusions, maybe, let's just see if I can. So basically, if you take the very large view, which we've tried to do here, you understand that the Chinese have created, as was shown in the film last night, some new markets. Markets Pronto Moda was not here. Prato didn't produce finished products, it produced cloth. So they've been very, very good at producing a new market. The Italians have long been in Prato as a creative force. They've been very, very innovative. But it looks to an outsider that the younger generation now is up against a wall. They haven't been able to figure out how to innovate, and yet they have that creative spirit deeply within them. So basically, it seems to me, and Gary and I have talked about this a great deal, that as difficult as it might be, the two sides, that is the Chinese and the Italians working in the tessuto industry here, are going to have to find a way to trust each other. And that word trust, Gabi has also written about this. Remember back to the contadini and what Absalom said. That was the main thing they took away from their post-war experience, was that it was possible to trust people that you didn't know, people who were very different from yourselves. It seems to me that that has been a bit lost here. But somehow, if these two sides could trust one another, there's actually an enormous opportunity here. Because the Chinese have developed new markets, and the Italians have the capacity to create and innovate within markets. So, in concluding, I guess basically, having come to Italy for over 40 years, I see that the situation is very serious, very dire even, but it's not impossible. It's all sitting there if the threads could be interwoven. So, I wanted to say one more thing. Speaking of interwoven, I used to teach young kids, and I always brought show and tell. I wanted to let you know that this coat serves two functions here in Prato. First of all, I bought it used, and I didn't mention that a great deal of the rags, a big hunk of them went off and were sold as used clothing all around the world. They still are. That is, stuff that looked good enough that wasn't shredded. The other thing is that it's made out of regenerated wool. So that's why I wore it. Okay, anyway, thank you. Questions?
Now the discussion is open, so if you have questions or comments, are very much appreciated. And I have indirectly cut the time for the presentation in order to have some time for discussion. Yeah. Guercini. Professor Guercini.
Thank you for the presentation. The hypothesis at the end is the one of collaborative evolution among the entrepreneurial forces and the two producers' communities more in general, maybe not just the entrepreneurs. Is it the second generation? Do you have other example, model that we can look at of a second generation of Chinese producers community which reach this kind of collaborative integration with local producers community? Does we have example models realized in that sense to look at in your experience, in your research? Did you encounter models about this, other examples?
Okay. Let me answer this in a way that doesn't answer your question exactly. Now, I, for many years, looked at the small firm economies in Taiwan. So you had a great many products produced through these small firm networks. But what happens is the economy changes, and the economy has changed in a way that the former retailers which are handling those products now become consolidated in larger retail groups, like the global retailers like Carrefour, and you begin to get larger merchandisers and larger retailers that in turn want to order goods in large batches, which turns the orders back to some firms in the small firm economy that grow large then and grow. So the whole structure of the small firm economies begin to change under pressures brought from the outside. Now, so it's a form of collaboration. I mean, it brings changes, and it creates a context for innovation, but it changes the whole structure of those small firm economies. And that's what's happened to the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese have gone to China. They make Apple products. Hong Hai makes most of the Apple products. They were once a little bitty firm, but through good luck, fortuitous event, smart leadership, they were able to work through that small firm economy and grow large, capture the orders, and they still do lots of subcontracting, but they're sort of the lead firm now in that whole structure. So that maybe that's the way it might be done here, is that you would develop a kind of different structure out of these small firms that would be feed into a larger distribution network.
Other questions?
Just following on from that point, I wondered whether the inventore that have been spoken of may be a vehicle for that type of collaboration, cooperation?
Possibly. The way I understand it, and maybe Don should answer this, that institution still exists. That middleman, the arranger position still exists. But I'm speaking from ignorance now. I don't know what kind of firm that middle person has, whether it's able to go larger. What happened in Asia was that you begin to do away with those middlemen and do direct purchasing from the groups. So I don't know the answer here.
I think that it's going to depend on whether the imprenditori can a bit grow themselves into a new possibility. Certainly, they are in a position to understand how to be a liaison between the various parts. But as Gary mentions, as size becomes important, they're going to have bigger clients, people who are willing to trust them in the beginning. And my guess is that they will be instrumental in the beginning of this change to larger corporations. Once bigger corporations get involved, they probably won't any longer need the middleman. But in the beginning, it's those people who know who's making what and where it can be made, because they have their fingers in all the pies. They know who is it. Because Prato, and I didn't say this earlier, but I think everyone knows this here, the process of production has always been very, very widely distributed, so that each part of the production was done separately. It's true, there were a few very large firms, but most of the production here has been done literally in parts. And the imprenditori was the glue that held all those parts together.
Questions?
Thank you for your wonderful speech. And you know Chinese immigrants very well. And I came from Wenzhou, and I know most immigrants to Europe are from the poor area from Wenzhou. And like me, in downtown, we have few people immigrant to foreign countries. And what my question is, there is a very interesting term, temporary migration and permanent migration. It sounds that Chinese immigration just like temporary immigration. And I want to know in what conditions temporary immigration can become permanent migration. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I've looked at that. Well, first of all, as I tried to describe, the temporary migration is not necessarily something that each individual thinks. That they don't go with the idea that I'm just going to be temporary. Many of them do, but some of them may want to just leave permanently, and so they sort of get on this train, and the train is this migration chain that they go to where their relatives are or their friend's friend is, and so they begin that process of going out, and any step along the way they can opt out. But the fact is that there's many social forces that keep them temporary. So there's the debt relationships, the reciprocity, the idea that you owe your livelihood to somebody else. So there's a certain personal honor that goes along with keeping you inside the Chinese community. So one of the things which changes that is, for some examples, at the time of the Communist Revolution, the borders closed, and all those people in Southeast Asia couldn't go back. So they began to set up their lives in Southeast Asia as a permanent migration. So it completely changed. Temporary migration, as I tried to say at the end, does finally peter out. And you get children who learn Italian. We saw in the movie last night. They don't want to go back. They have no place back there. So there's lots of ways you fall out of this, but there's lots of also forces that keep you in. So.
Yes, I was really curious about the comment that had to do with the patrilineality of the places in China you've looked at, and the patriarchality, or patriarchal sort of orientation. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the context among migrant communities. We saw, for example, one of the slides that we saw in a previous presentation showed that I think 47% of the firms, the small firms in Prato, Chinese family firms, are owned by women, and about 53 or 54% by men, if I recall correctly. And that does make sense to me from the ethnographic research we've done here. And I just wonder if you've seen patterns in terms of migration and how family gendered structures get shifted as families become diasporic.
Even though they're patriarchal, it is usually the head of the household is a man. The Laoban's wife, the wife of the owner, has a very powerful role to play, and she frequently starts an independent firm that's or sometimes not related at all. I mean, it's an entrepreneurial atmosphere, and so you think about a family business, you don't think about one firm, you think about the possibilities of capitalizing multiple firms. So this structure generates not only a family firm, it generates multiple firms owned by the same family. And usually they will have the ownership split between a Laoban and a Laoban's wife. And it's very, very common. And when the man dies, often the woman takes over that role. So she's the Laoban. She's the boss. And in a single family firm, the wife normally keeps care of all the books takes care of all the laborers. I mean, we're talking about a family that really is, cooperatively making money. So the woman doesn't sit back in the house and raise children. I mean, she's out there working just as well as he is. So I'm not surprised that there are multiple firms and owned by women, because I think a lot of those you'll find the women and the man are in a jointly thinking through their opportunities here.
Shall we collect questions and reply connected because of the time? So please take some.
Looking at your last questions, your last one, have you any suggestions how to solve existing problems, and giving some suggestion maybe to the Prato local government how to solve existing problems like the huge illegal number of migrants, huge tax evasion, and the feeling of some of the population that maybe the situation has become difficult for them? So, I mean, this is a real problem as well. I understand that migration in the long run is very good, but, I mean, for the moment, maybe people don't trust each other. So what would your suggestion on that?
First of all, neither of us feel that we're the people to tell the Pratese government what to do. But secondly, I would like to remind you of something I said earlier on. The history of Prato has never been a top-down situation. Never. In its many, many, many centuries of doing business, the business has always come from the ground up. So I would argue that if the government here, if the state, suddenly said, we're going to tell you how to do this right, A, no one would listen to them, and B, it wouldn't work, because that's never been how things have been done here. So this is just my own point of view. I think if it's going to work, it's going to have to come from people across the aisle seeing it's to their mutual advantage to join together. And we saw that in the film last night. There were a few examples where both Chinese and Italian firms said they realized they could do even more if they worked with their complement.
So, let me add just something to that. Normally, individual to individual links doesn't solve the problem. You need to go through an associational context. So you need to have Chinese associations with Italian associations kind of linking to create an atmosphere where some cooperation can occur. That's my observation.
Sorry, just one more because of the time. Otherwise, we cannot have coffee. Oh no. And just one.
Thank you for the presentation. You discussed about the similarity between Chinese community in Asia, Southeast Asia, and Prato. From a longer perspective, do you think one day Prato's Chinese will become some kind of a local player as they are in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia?
No, I don't think so. I think the migration will probably end of its own. So there'll be fewer migrants going out, and those that return will return, those that remain will remain. And so there is not going to be that kind of monopolization of the economy as there occurs in Southeast Asia. I mean, Chinese really do control large swaths of the Southeast Asian economies. I don't think that's going to happen, say, in Italy or in France. I think the fact that Wenzhou is becoming a very modern area. You have a lot of young people can see their future in China as opposed to their future migrating back and forth. And so so in the long run, this is going to end. But right now, I mean, I think there is an opportunity for people, the Chinese who are here, to improve their conditions, to up their place in the market, so make more money here. And they would be able to make more money if they could actually join forces with some Italian entrepreneurs, perhaps.
So now we will end this session. Just a couple of words also from me. Thank you very much to our guests for their valuable contribution to this symposia. They presented a very broad and at the same time deep analysis of the present situation of Prato in the perspective of the global capitalism. Cleverly, they contrasted the two migrations to Prato and the subsequent success, economic success, first of Tuscan peasants after Second World War, that coincided with the takeoff of what we call industrial district, textile industrial district, and then the Wenzhou peasants in recent decades, and the success of their pronto moda, which they explains, as far as I've understood, as a formation of a small firm economy. What really struck me in reading the draft on Sunday was the basic similarities of the threads of their small firm economy conceptualization with our in Florence, the place of the rediscovery of the industrial district by Giacomo Beccattini, of the industrial district. These similarities are family firms, diffuse entrepreneurship, business networks, reciprocity, the importance of social glue, and society as the main force of the economic success, and informal institutions that enable circulation of credit, labor, information, skills, and so on. But more than for the analysis of the success, we have to thank our guests for the analysis of the causes of the recent decline of Prato's small firm economy, as they call it. And I agree that these causes are to be found both in changes inside the local society and outside in the global economy, both from the demand and the supply side of the textile industry. As we have seen also yesterday, Chinese migrants were able to recreate a successful small firm economy or industrial district in pronto moda. But changes in these recent years in China, the growth in China, economic growth in China, Wenzhou, and the crisis in Italy, Europe, and Prato can bring to stop the migration to Prato. And this, combined with the different attitude of the children of Wenzhou entrepreneurs, can cause the decline also of the Chinese small firm economy and pronto moda. Actually, since 2010, the number of Chinese-owned clothing firms is declining. So I will conclude stressing the conclusion of our keynote speakers that maybe Prato is once again in advance, having such a large number of Chinese migrants inside it. However, to transform this presence in an opportunity for the revival of Prato as a whole in the new global economy, it is compelling to bridge the gap that their words, I'm quoting, to bridge the gap, it's compelling to bridge the gap between the old and the new and between the native Pratese and the Chinese Pratese. Thank you very much to our... Thank you.